All right, me again. It's another brief one today about the Dust Bowl. Make sure you've got something to write with. Make sure you're ready to go. We're going to talk about one of the bigger things that made hard times in America even harder for some people. The Dust Bowl. Now, you've read about the Dust Bowl. A period of drought in the Great Plains that caused tremendous dust storms. What the book doesn't spend enough time talking about are the reasons why the Dust Bowl happened and the long-term effects of the Dust Bowl. What some people sometimes refer to as the worst hard times. And it really was the worst of it. For the people who lived in that area, the suffering was worse than anywhere else in America. Let's talk about what a dust storm is. When an area is without any vegetation, when there aren't any plants in the ground, and the wind blows across that, the wind can pick up particles of dirt and dust and create sandstorms and dust storms. This happened in the Great Plains in the 1930s on a level that nobody had ever seen before, and it was unclear to a lot of people why it was happening now and it hadn't happened before. And there are a lot of background reasons for it. But as these storms are happening, tremendous amounts of topsoil are being eroded away by the wind. The topsoil is what made that area as the rich, fertile farmland it had always been. Why was it now all blowing away? When you were caught in one of these dust storms, it would be very, very difficult for you to even see your hand in front of your face. I mean, you could put your hand up and you would not be able to see your fingers. There was so much dust flying around. People covered their mouths to avoid breathing in the dust. For the most part, if you were caught outside during a dust storm, you just sat down and waited for it to pass. There was no sense trying to get anywhere because you might fall into a ditch and hurt yourself if you tried to walk anywhere. You couldn't tell which direction you were going. It was painful. The dust abraded against your face, and it caused tremendous amounts of static electricity. Imagine what it was like, what it's like in the wintertime if you just walk across a carpet in stocking feet, and you go to shake somebody's hand, you get that shock. Well, imagine that 100 times worse. And literally, if you shake somebody's hand, you can knock them down. People talked about barbed wire fences glowing blue from all the electricity in the air, because it was billions and billions of particles of dust banging into each other. When they were over with, usually people had to dig out, just like you would after a snowstorm, but this time you're digging away dust and dirt. Going up to the top of your house and shoveling it off your roof because it's piling up on your roof, and there's a fear that the roof will collapse. Digging out sheds and outhouses in the back of the house because they're literally covered in dirt. Cows in the fields would die because their lungs would become clogged with dust, and when they autopsied these cows, they would find their lungs were solid from all the dust they'd inhaled. People were beginning to get an illness that they called dust pneumonia, and it was especially the elderly and the very young were dying of this disease, and it was caused by their lungs being impacted from all of this dust. Now, why did it happen? Well, it happened for a couple of reasons. The southern Great Plains was not, although it had tremendous topsoil, was not the best farmland because it didn't get as much rain as most other farmland. It went through cycles where you'd have 5-10 years of decent rain, and then a cycle of 5 or 10 years where it didn't rain as much, which is great if you happen to be farming during the rainy seasons, but not so great if you're farming during the drought parts of the cycle. Farmers planted in this environment anyway, and they didn't use the best farming practices. They didn't plant necessarily in ways that would prevent erosion. In areas where farming didn't work very well, there were a lot of people who grazed cattle, and the cattle would eat the grass. The problem is these plains had been grasslands for centuries and centuries, for thousands of years, and had deep sod, root networks that were bound together, sometimes a foot thick. Farmers on the plains were actually called sod busters because they had to cut through all of that in order to farm. But once you cut through that and start farming, the topsoil is loose unless there's crops planted in it. When the drought began, between having the cattle eat that grass right down to the roots and compact the soil so the grass didn't grow back, or the farmers plowing that sod under and planting their wheat and corn, between all of those things, when the drought hit, there wasn't anything stopping the soil from going away. The wind would pick it up. So between bad farming practices, you need to write this down, overgrazing by cattle, and drought, those three things made it so that when the wind blew, it picked up the dirt. And it picked it up in these huge clouds of dirt. They call them black blizzards because it felt in many ways as though you were in a blizzard. My dog has just decided to have a drink next to me. That's what you're hearing. These clouds would just envelop towns, and the worst ones, hundreds of people would die or dozens of people would die because they'd drive off the road, or because they couldn't see where they were going, or they'd walk into ditches and be hurt, or they'd catch death. They'd catch dust pneumonia and die from that. There were hundreds of deaths overall that were associated with the Dust Bowl. This was a region that was farmland, so it was a part of the country that was already impacted tremendously. We've talked about the farm crisis before and the fact that the farmers owed so much money to banks because they had put so much land under the plow during the war and borrowed money to do that. So an area that was already in economic crisis gets hit by this new crisis, the Dust Bowl. And what happens is, and then here's the long-term impact. So we'll take the short-term farming in this region is destroyed. Families are destroyed. People become broke, go bankrupt. Long-term impacts are interesting, though, because people from the region, the worst hit region in the panhandle of Oklahoma and the panhandle of Texas and parts of Kansas, and Arkansas, just picked up and left. They decided they couldn't stay. They moved. Most of them moved westward. They moved to California, where there were jobs available if you were willing to move from place to place as migrant workers. We've talked about migrant workers before, who go where the crops are ripening and pick the crops. It's not a great job, but it'll keep you alive if you can do the work regularly. So the farmers moved west. It's known as the Okie migration because the people from Oklahoma moved westward. And we've talked about a lot of migrations this year, the Great Migration with African Americans moving north, and westward migration and immigration coming from Europe. The Okie migration is the last great migration we're going to talk about. These southern Great Plains states, Oklahoma and Arkansas and Texas and parts of Colorado, practically empty of people. Not entirely. There are people who stayed, and the towns still exist that were there during the Dust Bowl, but they're greatly diminished. And it meant that the population of California increased dramatically. A lot of the Okie migration was to California, to the farms there, and the people who moved there tried to scratch a living as migrant workers. Now, on the front page of each of the Google Classrooms, there is a photograph by a woman named Dorothea Lange. On each of the classes it's different, but Dorothea Lange was a photographer hired by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, to chronicle the problems of the Great Depression. And she spent a lot of time with the migrant workers in California and with the Okies moving west with her camera, collecting photographs of what life was like. So take a look at that picture on the front page of your Google Classroom. It's by Dorothea Lange, and it's about the Okie migration and the Dust Bowl. This is Mr. Enright signing off. You guys have a lovely day.